Hello, everybody, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Masood Aman. I am Assistant Professor of Agronomy at the University of Agriculture, Faisalabad, and I will be moderating this webinar. So, before we start the formal proceedings, I would like to recite few verses from the Holy Quran. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر آمنت بالله صدق الله العظيم. Dear participants and honorable speakers, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all in today's webinar entitled Nutrients and Pesticide Pollution, a Potential Threat to Biodiversity. This webinar is organized in connection with the International Biodiversity Day that is being celebrated today across the globe with the theme From Agreement to Action, Build Back Biodiversity. Organizers of this webinar at the sub-campus Dipalpur Okada, University of Agriculture, Faisalabad, pay respect to all conservationists who are trying to protect Mother Nature through their efforts in research, policy, and education for actionable measures to build back biodiversity. In today's webinar, we are so very honored and pleased to have with us three guest speakers who are renowned researchers in their respective fields. We have with us Dr. Yuisong Gang, Associate Professor at the School of History, Geography and Tourism, Chengdu Normal University, China. Our second speaker is Dr. Sajjad Raza, who is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Chicago. Dr. Sajjad will present on consequences of inefficient nitrogen utilization on soil acidification, eutrophication, and biodiversity loss. And our last speaker is Dr. Mohammad Umair Syal, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Entomology at the University of Agriculture, Faisalabad, Pakistan. And he will present on pesticide pollution and its impact on biodiversity. First of all, for welcome note and webinar objectives, I would like to invite Dr. Tariq Aziz. Dr. Tariq Aziz is currently working as Associate Professor in Soil Science at the Institute of Soil and Environmental Sciences, University of Agriculture, Faisalabad, and also holds the position of Principal UF Subcampus Dipalpur Okada, Faisalabad. He's also the Regional Director of the International Nitrogen Initiative and lead partner from Pakistan for the South Asia Nitrogen Hub. May I now request Dr. Tariq Aziz for welcome note and for describing the objectives of webinar. So floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Masood. And I warmly welcome all of the participants who joined us in this webinar. I'm Tariq Aziz, as Dr. Masood has introduced. Thank you very much for your introduction, Daksa. The theme of today's international webinar is Nutrients and Pesticide Pollution, a Potential Threat to Biodiversity. As we all know that biodiversity is the variety and variability of life on Earth, including the diversity of species, genes, and systems. It is fundamental to human well-being and a healthy planet and economic prosperity for all. And today is the biggest challenge is ensuring the food security issues. And to ensure food, we are using the equivalent of 1.6 Earths to maintain the current way of life, and ecosystems cannot keep up with our demands. We have to produce more and more food. So 75% of the Earth's land surface has already been altered by the human actions, including about 85% of the wetland areas. And 66% of ocean area is impacted by human activities, including from fisheries and the pollution. And most importantly, the agricultural expansion is said to account about 70% of the projected loss of terrestrial biodiversity. So, resultantly, the biodiversity is decreasing at an alarming rate. And what are the most key drivers of species decline or the biodiversity decline? Here are the main 5 drivers, like habitat degradation, exploitation, invasive species and diseases, pollution, and the climate change. And you can see the most important is habitat degradation. But all of these 5 drivers are linked with one or the other way. To have to address all of these, to ensure food security, we are working to produce more and more food, and our global food system is the primary driver of biodiversity loss, with agriculture alone being the identified threat of 24,000 of the 28,000 species at risk of extinction. And one of the main issue or the driver is land use change for the agriculture. And if we see the graph, it is the environmental impacts of food and agriculture. And you can see that about 26% of all of the greenhouse gases emissions are directly related to the food production. And 50% of world's habitat land is used for agriculture, land use. And about 70% of global freshwater withdrawals are used for agriculture. 78% of the global ocean and the freshwater pollution, for example, eutrophication, is because of agriculture. 96% of global mammal biomass, including the livestock, is agriculture, and 71% of global bird biomass is poultry livestock. And very importantly, the current food production depends heavily on agricultural inputs like fertilizers, pesticides, energy, land, and water, and on unsustainable practices such as monocropping and heavy tilling. And all of this has reduced the variety of landscapes and habitats, threatening or destroying the breeding, feeding, and or nesting of the birds, mammals, insects, and microbial organisms, and crowding out many native plant species. So as a major contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions, our food systems is also driving climate change, which further degrades habitats and cause species to disperse to the new locations. Number of animal species losing habitat due to cropland expansion by 2050, the recent estimates, more than 1,000 species will lose about 25% of their habitat by 2050, and about 343 species will lose their habitat by more than 50%, and 94 species will more than 75%. So we are losing all of the habitats, and the projected habitat loss for all species in 2050, you can see. So just look at the pesticide use as an agriculture input. You can see that about 250,000 tons of pesticides used per year in China, in America, in Europe, and in some countries. So we are just adding more and more pesticides in our feeds. Of course, pesticides are necessary to produce more and more crops to save our crops from insect pest attacks and diseases. But are we using judiciously? So we see the breakdown, pesticide breakdown. We are currently using about 2.6 million tons in 2020. So most of these pesticides, we are using herbicides and fungicides and insecticides around the globe, and it is very clear that the increase has been done mostly in the Asia. If we can see that excess of phosphorus from the croplands, again, China, India, some parts of the America and Canada, they are applying much of the phosphorus than the required, and there is surplus of the phosphorus too. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and the pesticides, we are applying too much. And what is the pay? We have already paid in terms of deterioration of water quality, air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, and all of this has destroyed our ecosystem and soil quality. And resultantly, you can see some of the figures that there are dead zones in the freshwater as well as in the oceans. And we are deteriorating our habitat for many of the animals like pollinators, and air quality, soil quality, biodiversity loss, all are the results of heavy use of or unjudicious use of pesticides and the nutrients. In 2022 December, a framework was adopted at Coming Montreal, Canada, about global biodiversity, and it includes 4 goals and 23 targets to be achieved by 2030. And text listed below is taken from the final version of the framework that you can download the main documents. And I'm pleased to share that I was included in a group which has provided this background document. And the goal of this Coming Montreal Biodiversity Framework, there are 4 goals. I will be talking on only 2. That the goal A is the integrity, connectivity, and resilience of all ecosystems are maintained, enhanced, or restored substantially, increasing the area of natural ecosystems by 2050. Human-induced extinction of known threatened species is halted, and by 2050, extinction rate and risk of all species are reduced tenfold, and the abundance of native wild species increased to healthy and the resilient levels. And the genetic diversity within populations of wild and domesticated species is maintained, safeguarding their adaptive potentials by 2050. And the second goal is biodiversity is sustainably used and managed, and nature's contribution to people, including ecosystem functions and services, are valued, maintained, and enhanced, with those currently in decline being restored, supporting the achievement of sustainable development for the benefit of present and future generations by 2050. And among different goals, there were targets, and target 7 is to reduce pollution risk and negative impacts of pollution from all sources by 2030 to the levels that are not harmful to biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services, considering cumulative effects and including reducing excess nutrient loss to the environment by at least half, including through more efficient nutrient cycling and use. So the nations have already agreed that we have to reduce the nutrient loss by at least 50% by 2030. So reducing the overall risk from pesticides and highly hazardous chemicals by at least half, including through integrated pest management based on science, taking into account food security and livelihoods. Again, food security is the utmost important. So preventing, reducing, and working towards eliminating plastic pollution. This was the target 7 of Montreal document. And the background document which was provided by us, this is for the target 7. And I'm pleased that I was one of the authors of this document. And recently we have published a paper on the comment on this Montreal document, and we have highlighted the indicators to be used and indicators of the nutrient losses and indicators for the impacts of nutrients to the environment, like sources of the nitrogen and phosphorus pollutions or agriculture, industry, automobiles, factories, or the waste, and indicators are inorganic nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer use. The data can be seen from the FAO website or from the country levels. And there are indicators like nitrogen and phosphorus surplus in the agriculture, nitrogen and phosphorus in the wastewater, loss of reactive nitrogen to the environment, and trends in nitrogen depositions. And the indicators for the impacts like coastal eutrophication, potential based on nitrogen, phosphorus, and silica ratios in the rivers, and red list index impact of the pollution. For the pesticides, again, the agriculture and the household pesticides use and the waste and amount used. The indicators are amount used per area of the cropland, use per active ingredients, name and amount of the volume, concentration of highly hazardous pesticides use. So risk weighed or aggregate pesticide risk based on use, weighing use active ingredients, and there are some indicators based on the environmental concentrations like pesticide environmental concentrations by active ingredient and compartments like soil, surface, and the groundwater and atmosphere. So aggregate pesticide risk based on environmental concentrations. So this is just some of the indicators which we have identified to be included in the next COP16 meeting. And finally, all of the biodiversity loss reduction or the sustainable use of resources are linked to the Sustainable Development Goals like zero hunger, good health and well-being, clean water and sanitation, decent work and economic growth, climate action, life below water, life on land. And without sustainable biodiversity use and reducing the biodiversity loss, we cannot go with all of these Sustainable Development Goals. And if we fail to stop biodiversity loss, it could limit the safe operating margins for many other issues facing our planet Earth. Again, thank you all for joining, and I'm very much thankful to the presenters who joined us. Thank you very much. That's up, over to you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your introductory talk, welcome note, and for describing the objectives of this webinar.